Take you to another part of the story, temperatures dropping across the country and flooding in the Eastern Cape, where 49 people lost their lives. We're joined by Samatha Meyrick from IPSS Medical Rescue to talk about the challenges and the planning that goes into rescue missions. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time, Samatha. Just listening in to some of the big challenges that Gift of the Givers was talking to, having access to areas where people are in desperate need of help. Talk to us about some of the strategy and planning that goes into assisting people.
At the start of, disasters such as this, the planning in the beginning is often very, very challenging. I mean, you can see the extent of the damage and, it is frightening. And often, trying to access the areas, especially so soon after a storm with the mud and the debris. Yes, planning is very, very important. However, in a disaster such as this, it's also very difficult with communication.
We've also just learnt of what's happening on the ground. Community members, families are hoping that their loved ones are still alive as the rescue mission gets underway. But we're also learning that overnight, the death toll is expected to rise. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Unfortunately, the sad reality is, especially, with flooding and, any, disasters involving, flooding water, is that, the longer someone goes missing, the chances of them being found alive, decreases rapidly. In searches such as this, the community plays such a vital role in searching for these victims that, often any victims that have survived are found quite soon after, the disaster by the community and by rescuers. When you start going into day 2 and 3, it does become more of a recovery than a rescue.
And during that recovery process, what are your teams having to deal with? What are the most pressing concerns as they navigate the waters?
Often their own safety. Fast-flowing rivers, there's a lot of debris after flooding. You're not knowing what is beneath the water. Rescuers also have to be mindful of their own safety and well-being. But fortunately, as the flood water does start to recede, it does become a little bit easier for rescuers. But, the longer it goes, the harder it becomes to find the missing victims.
And what does the team rely on in terms of navigation and moving closer towards finding someone?
Experience comes into play, looking at where victims were last seen, and then trying to plot the most likely place. They could have been washed down. Where could they have, grabbed onto or been washed against, buildings, debris, trees, but it's also the importance of the local community and their knowledge of their area, working hand in hand with rescuers to, try to track down their missing loved ones.
And very lastly, what advice would you have for those who may find themselves in such a predicament where, they're met with flood waters and having to decide what to do?
In situations like this, it's why it's so important to listen, for warnings and be mindful of these warnings. If the river starts to rise, you need to move away from it as quickly as possible. Don't attempt to cross the river during the initial flooding, even in vehicles. Sadly, the taxi with the young children being washed away, it's devastating, but that's reality when vehicles try and cross low-lying river bridges and roads close to the rivers. People underestimate the strength of water. The safest option is just to move away as quickly as possible and don't try to cross it.
Very well. Thank you so much. Thanks for speaking to us this evening. Samatha Meyrick from IPSS Medical Rescue, talking to us there about some of the challenges and the planning that goes into rescue missions.